Good morning, everyone. For today, I want to thank Miss Amy Pratt for sending us a lovely picture from somewhere around here in Texas, I think, according to what she said to me. So thank you for that. Today, just a second, let me share my screen with you. There it is. Today, we're going to finish the topic of international treaties, talking about different institutions. We'll get to that. Reminding you again that I have sent you earlier this week your midterm task with my comments. If you have any questions on that, you're more than welcome to come talk to me about it during office hours this week or next week or whenever you want. The number one recommendation that I want to offer you based on that I actually send it to everyone when I send you your work is that if you have any kind of challenges, kind of difficulties that you're facing when you're writing those kinds of projects, then come and talk to me on office hours. That's exactly why I had it. I had a number of students who came to talk to me, and I think I can say I helped them a little bit, at least to shape their argument. And that was one of the main comments that I had for a lot of you, that sometimes it was not very clear to me what you were trying to say. So if you come and talk to me beforehand, we can workshop that together, and then it's going to be also easier for you to write those things down. Writing is a lot of practice, so this is part of it, right? All right, let us begin. First, before we start, a quick review on Tuesday's topics, so we can also be right in the place that we were. Introduce the topic of international treaties. Talks about different types regarding to how binding they are. So there were more binding types of agreement, there were less binding. The importance of the ratification process, the signal that it sends in regarding to the intention to comply with the agreement, and that led to a much wider discussion regarding the issue of compliance, the problem of compliance with international treaties, of course, because there's no one actor or one entity that can enforce those agreements. That requires in a lot of cases of self-compliance, and a lot of those are based on mechanisms such as reciprocity that we talked about, as well as a reputation. Not following along with the details of the treaty, regardless of the issue area, usually involves high reputation costs. So that's one of the mechanisms or one of the incentives for members that sign those kind of treaties to follow through. And the main problem, of course, of credible commitment that I've talked about it a lot. And then we talked about different types of agreements. I started actually with the ones who are less, famous, if you want to call that, when it comes to environmental protection and the main problem those kinds of agreements face, especially since they also involve addressing private actors or members of the private sector, and adding them into this whole commitment compliance complexity makes the issues a lot more problematic. I talked about the Deepwater Horizon disaster and the problems that were associated with that. Then human rights agreements, again, the problem of really making sure that everybody cares about that, and then actually enforcing that is a lot more problematic, especially enforcement was very problematic. And then I started talking about international treaties in the context of national security, focusing on the study by Valentino and his colleagues about the laws of war. And the main finding they showed, just reminding you again, that the norms of that the international treaties in many cases are promoting were not the most powerful factor that shaped the behavior eventually. It was mostly the strategy those countries have adopted. So that's a little too long of a review of what we talked about on Tuesday, but I hope it's going to make it easier to go right into the discussion that we have today. If you have any questions about it, as always, email me or come talk to me on office hours. Okay, so I'm starting again with, this is the same slide that you had at the end of Tuesday's lecture. Just make sure that we're easing into the topic again. International legal agreements are very important when it comes to the interactions of states, when it comes to war, when it comes to peace, any type of interactions. There are different types of agreements, of course, in the context of national security, led by alliances, which we'll talk about a lot today, and defense pacts, as well as peace agreements and kinds of different types of treaties which involve deciding territorial boundaries. And lastly, the one we talked about on Tuesday more was treaties that engage with the laws of war themselves. As always, the main problem, thinking about it from a rational standpoint, how do we credibly commit to those agreements, especially in the context of national security. There's no one country in the world, there's no super government that can enforce an agreement when it comes to security. So credible commitment is a problematic issue, and the treaty in this case is intended to address those problems. And the treaty, by signing a treaty, the members of those of the countries that signed the treaty are providing in signals that they are intent to actually comply with different terms of the treaty. And we're focusing mostly on alliances now. Alliances, the idea behind those kinds of treaties is that it represents a signal that states will provide, will intervene militarily under certain condition if war erupts and provide military assistance. So that was the background. And now I want to go more in specifics into alliances, military alliances. So let's start with some definition. An alliance is a written agreement signed by the official representative of at least two, sometimes more, of independent states. And this agreement includes information and promises to provide military assistance or aid in the case of a conflict. There are different types of alliances, and we'll talk about them now. So there's offensive or defensive cooperation types of alliances. There's a neutrality or non-aggression pacts, and there's also a consultation type of agreement in situations that may lead to a military conflict. Now, one of the important things we need to think about I want to emphasize when we talk about those kinds of treaties today is to account for the differences, for the variations in the content and the language that those different agreements have. Those different types of alliances have different types of agreements, and we have to account for the differences in the contents of those agreements in order to understand how they affect the basic theoretical concept that I've talked about on Tuesday of compliance, enforcement, and actually intention to abide by those agreements. So one of the central questions that the research has raised when it comes to alliances is, do alliances contribute to decreases in the risk of war? So if I have an alliance with country, whatever that is this reduces the chances that I'm going to be part of a conflict? And as I said, one of the things that we should focus on when we're considering this role of alliances is to focus on the content of those alliances. And that is important for us in order to understand what the commitment actually is. What is the ally that I'm signing the agreement with actually promises to me, or what do I promise in return? So we have to look at the content of those alliance agreements as an information that is provided, and it's a signal both to the members of the alliance. Of if I'm signing an alliance with China, it's information for both of us. It's also information for our rivals. So anybody who's my rival also should learn based on the type of information that there is in the agreement. And that has an effect, of course, on the calculation of those rivals when it comes to whether they are more likely or less likely to initiate violence. All right. So I want to talk about it based on the research that you had in the paper. It actually was for the Tuesday reading list. It was the Leeds paper. Professor Leeds is one of the, excuse me. As I was saying, Professor Leeds is one of the experts when it comes to military alliances. She's a professor at the University of Rice University in Houston. And the paper that you had for today was one of her most important studies that addressed this effect of alliances on the risks of war. So we begin with the understanding that, of course, alliances, the main problem with them is that they, the credible commitment issue. If I sign an alliance with country B, if country B now faces war, will I actually follow through with the alliance and come and intervene or provide assistance to the other country? So we have to focus, as Leeds have argued, is that to focus on the information, and official military alliances will provide us information about the likelihood of intervention. So it provides us information about the intentions, about the future intentions of members of the parties that signed the alliance, as well as creating incentives for their behavior. What do we mean by that? We mean that alliances represent, as we said, for international treaties overhaul, they represent the signal. So in this case, they represent a costly signal. They involve either a sunk cost, the actual formation of an alliances is already a cost that I'm paying, which means if I already sign an agreement, then I'm already paying something at the moment, even without actually enforcing it. And it also represents reputation cost in case of whether I'm failing to fulfill the obligation. So if I'm signing an alliance again with country B and country B faces conflict and I decide not to join, then I'm facing severe reputation cost because I failed to fulfill my obligations according to the agreement of the alliance. By having those kinds of costs, which are very, very real, that means that the information the alliance treaty itself provides is a reliable information. Okay. So in her study, Leeds addresses three central types of alliances, and she focuses, of course, as I said, on the content, on the information. What does this represent in terms of the intentions of the sides that have signed the alliance, as well as the incentives they have for behavior. So let's break it down. The first type that she talks about is what's called the Mutual Defense Pact. It's the most obvious type of alliance in which both parties promise active military assistance in the event that one of them is under attack. And what kind of intentions, what kind of behavior that signals those kinds of alliances? Let's think about it from a challenger's perspective. If I'm country A, I sign an alliance with country B, and there's also a rival, country C. It makes sense for country C to attack me, country A, if country C thinks they're more likely to win the war. However, once I sign that kind of an alliance, that's kind of an agreement with country B, then that affects the calculus of country C, because country C has to understand it has information from that agreement that if country C is going to decide to attack me, country A, it will also have to face my ally, country B, right? That's what's called, that creates what's called here the deterrent effect, and that should reduce the likelihood of conflict initiation, of being engaged in a conflict. That's the idea behind Mutual Defense Pact. Another type that she addresses is what's called a Neutrality Pact. It's a promise that under certain conditions, states will not participate in a conflict on the side of the partner's adversaries. So again, let's go back to the example of country A and B. I'm country A, I'm signing a neutrality pact with country B, which means that I'm promising to country B, I will not cooperate with its own rivals if country B is going to go into a conflict. That's the idea behind that. It also provides assurances of non-intervention, and in some cases, it's also called sometimes non-aggression pacts. The information that we gain out of this kind of agreement is also might be problematic when you think about that, because if I'm signing an agreement with country B and I'm promising to country B, I will not join your rivals in fighting against you, that might actually encourage country B, if it already has some aggressive intentions, it might encourage that country to engage in a conflict, because I have already promised country B, I will not join any kind of coalition against you. So you can go ahead and attack country C, I will not join country C. So this kind of a pact provides information that signals to both country B and as well as to country C in that matter, that the risk of war is actually higher. As an example for a neutrality pact, I'll take you back to the good old 1860s. The 7 Weeks' War was fought between Austria and Prussia back in the summer of 1866. It was one of those common conflicts that were fought in Europe during the second half of the 19th century. For our purposes, Austria, one of the members of this war, has signed a neutrality pact with France, and the pact ensured that France was going to remain neutral in that conflict, and in exchange for French neutrality, they will promise territorial concessions from Austria after the war is going to end. So this is one example for a neutrality pact that was signed quite some time ago, but those were the conditions that were met, and that was the idea behind it. France will not join Prussia in fighting against Austria. That's the idea behind that. Okay, the third type of treaty that Leeds is addressing is an offensive pact. It promises active military support in cases which are not directly related to attack on any member of this alliance. For any kind of an aggressive actor, if again I'm signing this kind of agreement with country B, and country B he's already had kind of aggressive intentions, it should only embolden those intentions by country B because it knows it has my support. Based on the conditions and the terms of this pact, I have promised to provide military support for country B. So any kind of leader who wishes to promote her interest using force, such an agreement will only serve to increase the chances of conflict. So while a mutual defense pact is projected to reduce the risk of war, neutrality and offensive pacts have actually increased the risk of war. So what does the Leeds does? She collects data on alliances between 1816 and 1944. She focuses on testing the likelihood of conflict among dyads, which means between two countries. This is a more direct test because it allows to look directly at combinations of two countries and see what the risk is that those will going to engage in a conflict based on the main explanation that she proposes regarding the effect of different types of alliances. And what does she find? You see that on that figure here very nicely. So we have the three different types. Defense to target is the mutual defense pact. Offense is the offensive pact and neutrality pact. And on the y-axis, we have the change in the probability of initiation of a conflict. And think about it, when you see those kinds of figures, it's always in comparison to something. So those three different values are always in comparison to something. So in this case, it's in comparison to having no alliances. So let's break it down one by one. So for example, this is the mutual defense pact. The probability that the country is going to engage in a conflict, if that country has a mutual defense pact compared to not having a alliance at all, is 30% lower. So it's 30%, almost 30% lower chances of going into war if a country has a mutual defense pact compared to not having an alliance at all. On the other hand, having an offensive pact or neutrality pact means that the chances of going into conflict are in this case almost 50%, in this case almost 60% higher compared to having no alliances at all. So as she predicted in this research, those kinds of agreements increase the likelihood of war compared to no agreements at all, and the mutual defense pact decreases that. But mostly the main implications we can draw out of that research is the important role that the information, the type of alliance agreement that countries sign, and how that affects, in this case, the actions in the international context of war in this case. All right. I want to look at another aspect of alliances. Now we'll talk about different aspects of military treaties, not just alliances. First, we'll talk about alliances again. This is a research by Johnson from a couple of years ago. And the focus here in this case is on the concessions, the extent of concessions required in order to reach an alliance treaty. The focus is on the conditions that shape the formation of alliances, especially focusing again on what type of concessions the weaker states have to offer to a stronger state in order for the stronger state to be its ally and ensure its security. Also, based on the Leeds paper, this work by Johnson also focuses on the contents of the treaty, and that's of course depending and is also a function of the characteristics of the actors that sign them and their rivals. So let's talk about this a little bit more. The typical view of alliance trade-off is that when a weak state is seeking an ally and strong state to be its ally, then the strong state will try and get policy concessions from the weak state in order to ensure its security. So if I'm the strong state and I'm in negotiation now with a weaker state, country B again, I will demand different concessions from country B, and in exchange, I will offer my umbrella of security, if you want to call it that way. We have to think about it not just in that context, but we should also think about it in the case of how does the alliance changes the power relations between myself, but also between the weaker state and its own rivals. How is that going to change the distribution of power between all the members? So one of the ways we can talk about that is as a bargaining game between the target state, which in this case, as I said, let's call it country B, the weaker state, and its potential ally, country A, the strong state. I will be country A for that matter. So there's a bargaining game between myself and country B to reach an agreement regarding I'm offering security. In exchange, I'm demanding several sets of concessions. The question is how much concessions I'm going to demand. And the question again here is what's going to determine those concessions? How many concessions I'm going to demand, or what's the volume overall? Doesn't have to be specifically numbers, but overall. So the setting we have to think about for this game is what's called the shadow of external threat. So an alliance will be created when a target state, again, country B, views itself under a threat from a potential attack by any kind of external challenges. So if country B faces long shadow, so there's a substantial threat on country B's security from country C, which may attack it, then it's going to face a longer shadow of threat, and that means that the extent of concession it's going to offer me in order to be its ally are going to be much higher, because it faces very risky situation. It fears that country C is going to attack it, and there's going to be severe damages. So country B, the weaker state in this bargaining game between A and B, reminding you again that A, strong state, is me, country B is willing to offer a lot more concessions in order to ensure my security, in order also to prevent the attack from country C. That's the idea behind that. So some of the findings that the research shows, this is overall the breakdown of the number of concessions in the data. So on the left hand here, you have the entire data set. As I said a couple of times when I'm showing you those kinds of things, I'm trying to point out, make sure that you understand what you see in the figure. So here you have all observation, the total number of observation that this this study offers is 724 types of alliances. So think about that when you think about those percentages that you have here on the y-axis. So there's about almost 30% of those 724 which has no concessions at all, which is good because we need to account for variation in the results, but we need also to understand what we're looking at. So as you can see, also there's about almost 20% of those agreements which has 4 concessions, which is not insignificant amount. It's pretty substantial. What can we learn from this very general breakdown? That during World War I, World War II, the vast majority of alliance agreements did not require any concessions. We can also learn during the Cold War period, which is the largest number of observations here. You see there's 503 out of the 724. There's, again, over 30% has 2 concessions, about 20%, I think, is about 4 concessions. Right, but this is also a very important one to think about. So that's a general breakdown of the number of concessions. But again, the question that's interesting to us is what affects those concessions? Why would weaker states offer more or less concessions to stronger states facing this shadow of external threat? So this is the other breakdown that the paper has. There's 2 different models. So if we look here first on the left-hand side, what we see here is the probability of the target state, which again is the weaker state, how likely it is to win the war, and the probability, reminding you, probabilities run between 0 and 1. So the more likely it is that the weaker state is going to win its conflict, the number of concessions going to offer, again, the trend line here is negative, is going to be lower. So if country B is more likely to win its conflict with country C, it's not going to be willing to offer me a lot of concessions in exchange for my security, because it feels more secure. It's going to be able to win the war. And the exact opposite effect is evident when we look at the contribution that me, the strong state here, country A, is expected to provide. The more I need to contribute to this interaction, the more concessions that I will demand and probably going to get. That's the idea. So those kinds of some of the factors that shape those dynamics in interaction between those countries. Okay, Now let's talk about a different type of military treaties. I want to talk about arms controls agreements or treaties. They're another example of treaties in the context of national security. Arms control treaties are intended to ban the use of certain types of weapons, restricts the proliferation for other versions of these weapons. And the objective overall of those kinds of agreements is to reduce the likelihood of a dangerous arms race. And we already know the risks that arms races represent in terms of leading to conflicts and then even large-scale wars. We talked about a lot when I talked about realism and neorealism, and in your papers that a very substantial amount, percentage of you have written your midterm task on realism. You understand the risk that the arms race represent in the context of a realist perspective. For arms race is a problem, and those kinds of treaties are intended to account for that. So this is based on the research that you had in your reading for today, the Furman and Lupo paper, focusing on the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, instituted back in 1970. Essentially, it requires the countries that signed that agreement to refrain from building nuclear weapons. At the same time, it still allows 5 strong states to maintain nuclear arsenals. And we can see the breakdown here based on this very nice map. So the 5 countries that can maintain nuclear weapons are the United States and Russia, as well as China, France, and the United Kingdom, the one that we have here on the green. There are countries in the world which possess nuclear weapons, but they do not sign the NPT. And that includes India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, and South Sudan. For me, honestly, it's not the best company I want to be with, but that's what we have. North Korea used to be a part of the NPT and withdrew from the agreement. And as you can see, the vast majority of countries in the world have signed the treaty, but they do not possess nuclear weapons, of course. When we think about the NPT as an international treaty and the context of all the different mechanisms that relate to compliance and enforcement, so signing this kind of agreement should represent an important commitment mechanism, because being a member of the NPT community, if you want to call that, includes substantial demands in terms of inspections. Single states that sign the treaty can operate to prevent others from acquiring that technology. So those that sign the treaty can engage in different types of actions in order to prevent others from acquiring nuclear technology. And violators, those that are not within the treaty, face substantial risk of economic sanctions, such as we know that are over North Korea, for example, or Pakistan in the past. And they have a very face the risk of being placed as having bad reputation. So that's just a general description of the non-proliferation treaty that we're going to talk about. So let's talk a little bit about the questions and the theories behind that. So one of the main questions that are being asked in this context is, does this agreement help limiting the spread of nuclear weapons? And the focus of the authors for this study is, again, on the ratification process. Again, reminding you that from a theoretical standpoint, the ratification process is a very important element, signaling intention to actually comply. And the argument is that when you ratify this agreement after signing it, it reduces the extent of proliferation of nuclear weapons. However, there's a counter-argument which involves 2 different aspects to why the NPT does not actually promote a decrease in the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So one explanation is based on the strategic selection. The idea behind that, it's not that signing the agreement has reduced the likelihood that the country will proliferate nuclear weapons, but exactly the opposite, is that the countries that signed the NPT were already in a situation where they had no intentions of acquiring the weapons, so they ratified the agreement. They had no intentions to acquire nuclear weapons, so they ratified the NPT, and got some benefits out of it in terms of their status in the world and the way they were described. So that was a selection. They were what's called selected into the agreement by having no intentions to acquire those kinds of weapons in the first place. What that explanation suggests is that the treaty does not constrain the proliferation of weapons. It just screens from those that intend to have those kinds of weapons to those that do not. So that's one problem with that. The other one is a more common criticism, if you want to call it that, for international treaties, and that's the idea of an institutional weakness. The cost of this being discovered as a violator do not necessarily exceed the benefits, especially when countries face substantial risk of national security. So even if I'm already signed the agreement or I intend to sign, and I'm facing a high risk of national security, and the benefits of having this kind of technology, nuclear technology, are much higher than the cost of violating the agreement. Essentially, it says that states are willing to pay the price for developing nuclear weapons, also because the guidelines and the enforcement of the treaty is not the most efficient process. So that's the explanations why not. So what the authors are doing is that they're arguing that to test those kinds of arguments, we need to focus on the process in which states self-select into membership into this treaty. Right? So that's accounting for this self-selection argument, trying to see whether it's the ratification process, building incentives to refrain from proliferation, or the other way around. So they're focusing, as I said, is on the ratification of the treaty. And what are they doing is that one thing that they do is that they compare the process for ratification of the NPT to the ratification process for agreements in other areas, whether those are national security ones, including arms, or human rights or communications. So comparing those processes in order to understand how does the ratification of the nuclear treaty is different from others. They also account for a second stage, in this case, the estimating the likelihood of keeping with the commitment. Unfortunately, they don't have very pretty figures to show the results, but overall what they find is that the treaty has a positive effect on curbing the spread of nuclear weapons in those time frames that they have, 1970 to 2000, even after they account in their analysis for the self-selection into the treaty. So even if you account for those countries that have ratified the treaty because they had no intentions to, it still had the positive effect that they expected it to have. One of the things that they find within their data is that when they look at the smaller sample of states within their overall data, those states have more incentives to pursue the bomb because they face substantial security threats and have the economic capacity to engage in a nuclear program. Those countries were still constrained by signing the NPT agreement. So in this case, they found positive effect for the treaty on the behavior. All right, the last thing I want to do in the last part of discussion today is to address the effects of international treaties in the other big area when it comes to IR, and that's political economy. So how do international treaties affect different actions when it comes to economic policy? The first thing I'm talking about is going to be what's called the BITs, the bilateral investment treaties. These are agreements that are signed between a host state and an external actor that provides FDI. FDI is foreign direct investment. So that's a foreign investor which provides financial support for different types of project, whether it is infrastructure project or financial projects for a country. It is more common for mostly developing countries to sign those kinds of an agreement. And there's a lot of research on that topic because of this idea of the different incentives for international treaties, and we want to talk about it now. So how do these treaties work? We talked about the problems of credible commitment and the risks for signing the agreement overall and compliance and enforcement. So for the developing country that signed this agreement, the BIT, in this case, serve as a commitment mechanism that signals the intentions to preserve or to keep with the property rights of the investor, as well as to protect the investor. So it's not just protection from a security standpoint, it's protection from an economic standpoint, and legal standpoint. So if there's any income or revenues that the investor is expected to collect from this project, then this revenue will actually get to the hands of the investor. It also has the added tool of a legal mechanism to settle disputes between the country where the money is invested and the external investor. And that increases the cost for the government for if it considers to renege on the agreement and harm the investor's rights. So overall, the BITs represent a valuable tool for leaders of autocratic countries to attract finances that's going to help develop the countries from an economic standpoint, especially because autocrats face severe problems when it comes to this showing credible commitment to the investor. So having those kinds of agreement allows to, in a way, overcome that. So first of all, how does that look in terms of the data itself? So this is from the research I'm going to talk about in a second. It shows the relationship between the number of treaties that are signed and the extent of FDI that flows into the country. So you can see here that there's overall positive trend line between signing a high number of bits and having substantial amount of financial support from external investors. So overall, we have here a positive association between the number of treaties signed and the extent of FDI. But at the same time, we also think there's a lot of variation between the different countries. You can see that a lot of those countries are developing countries. We have here Sudan, and we have here Jordan, and Iran, and we have Egypt, Vietnam. So, but still there's a lot of variation, and we want to try and think about what explains this variation within the countries. So overall, the relationship is positive. So the effect works the way that we expect it to work. But why is there still a variation between countries? So this is the paper, a very recent one by Chen and Yi, and they offer a political account for those variations by looking at the incentives of autocrats to sign those treaties as a function of their perceptions to their threat of their regime survival. So each leader essentially is facing or considers the different chances that his regime is going to survive for the foreseeable future or not. And I'm going to go into this perception in a second, talking about the theoretical concept in a minute. But the basic idea behind that is that those leaders, those dictators in most cases, but not always dictators, but the vast majority of them are, that view their survival as secure, have incentives to sign those treaties, enjoy their benefits of a substantial amount of financial flow into the country, but also accept the limitations, which means they cannot intervene in those projects, they cannot nationalize them, because one of the risks for investor in this case is that the leader, the dictator, will nationalize the project, and then it's going to not only take control of the project, it's also going to collect all the revenue from it. So the main factor which relate to this view of expected political survival, it's called time horizons, which surprisingly or not, is also the topic of my dissertation. So I can talk about it for a lot more than what we're talking now, but I'll limit the discussion for now. The idea is that time horizons represent the view of leaders as to their expected time remaining in office, as the expected survival of their regime. And one of the important elements to distinguish when it comes to time horizons between different types of regimes. So democracies have fixed elections over a number of years every time. So leaders of democracies first have to cater for the demands of their supporters in order to ensure that their specific leadership will continue. And because those elections are relatively close every time, even if this 4 years, like in the United States case, or other countries have elections every 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, whatever the number is, the idea is that leaders of democratic countries tends to view much higher risk for their political survival, so they will likely to have a more short-term view. They will focus on the short term because their survival is facing a lot more competition, and they have to ensure in the short term that they provide benefits to their supporters so they will be able to remain in office. So that's democracies have more likely that leaders in democracies will have a short time horizon. On the other hand, autocrats tends to, in most cases, rule for life, and they are not subjected to the same amount of public scrutiny as democracies. There is some amount of public pressure on autocrats, but it's not to the same extent, of course. So they're less concerned about their expected political survival, which means that they are more likely to have what's called a more long time horizon. Their survival is a lot more secure, so they have long time horizon. Now, how do we use all that information in the context of FDI and bits? So FDIs are more likely to be a channel to developing countries, which in many cases are led by dictators. So we expect them to have a longer time horizon, but even in this case, there's potential for some variation. Long-term oriented autocrats foresee no immediate threat to their rule, so they have incentives to sign the bits, comply with the treaty, and enjoy the benefits. They will outweigh the cost for those who are not expected to face substantial risk for their political survival. On the other hand, those who are more short-term oriented face much more uncertainty when it comes to their political survival, and they have more incentives to violate. So first of all, why would, or what types of autocrats will face risk for their political survival? One example in this case, and there's a lot of research on that, I'm not going to go into that, is autocrats who just got hold of their position. So I'm the son of the dictator that ruled some country, and he just died, so I just assumed his power. So very early in my tenure, I'm still haven't established, I have yet to establish control over my country, so my political survival is still at high risk. So this is one type of dictator which has incentives to violate those kinds of agreements. And the main reason for that is that by violating the terms of the bit of the treaty, those kinds of leaders can collect the foreign revenue, the foreign money that comes into the country, and then they're able to exploit those external income, distribute it to their rivals, co-opt their rival, and secure their political survival by securing their own coalition. Remind you again when I talked about the winning coalition in this electorate theory logic, anybody that may represent a risk for my political survival as a new young autocrat, I can provide them with the money that I got from the FDI, from the external investor, and then reduce the risk for my political survival. So that means that short-term oriented autocrats are more likely to have incentives to violate those kinds of agreements. And this is one of the findings, one of the results that they show. What you see here, again, reminding you to always look at the different axes and understand what they show. What you have here on the y-axis is the percentage of the treaties which are not signed, right? So the effect is actually the opposite of what you would expect. And we have a line that shows the perception of survival for those who represent high risk for their survival. So those who are more likely to have a short-term orientation, and those who have low risk, so they will have long-term orientation. And what you see here is the exact, that's exactly the difference in this case, is that those who have high, they're viewing high risk for their survival, have higher percentage of those treaties not signed compared to those who have much lower risk of survival. So that's just one finding in this case showing how those kinds of incentives affect compliance with an international agreement in the context of the economic area. Before I go into the final part of the discussion today, I'll stop for the attendance word for today. The attendance word for today is the word show. Show is the attendance word. All right, last topic in the discussion is the role of international institutions. International institutions, it's a category that reflects both different types of agreements that I've talked about on Tuesday and today. Those fit to this category of international institutions, but international institutions also include different types of organizations, and we're talking here about organizations in the economic area. So one question we can talk about is, why do we want to join international organizations? And the focus for the remainder of the discussion I have for today is going to be on the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization is responsible and focusing on endorsing free trade around the world, puts pressure on countries to reduce their global tariffs, and offers incentives for economic integration for the different countries in the world. And being a member of the World Trade Organization includes certain benefits. Overall, it's a greater access to global markets. And it also includes being designated as a most favored nation status, which again, overall, it's just better conditions from an economic standpoint that enhances trade for the country that joins the organization. It allows greater exports and improve the market conditions when it comes to importing products. So overall, trade is flowing a lot more easily and should increase the benefits for the country that joins the organization. And that's exactly the main point of the question here in this is, does being a member of the World Trade Organizations, or in its former name, it's what was called the GATT, G-A-T-T, does it really promote global trade? And the evidence in this case is mixed. There is, over the last 10 years, there's been 10, 15 years, there's been a debate between different scholars about whether membership actually increased trade flows into the countries that are members of the trade organizations, of the international organization in this case. So as I said, we're focusing on the World Trade Organizations, and we're looking at the accession process to understand whether actually being a member of the World Trade Organization has a positive effect on the trade flows to different countries. We're going to focus on the process of joining the organizations. And this is a process that involves multiple rounds of questioning and different requirements to alter the economic policy fitting with the organization's requirements or demands. The primary demand in this process is states need to remove restrictions on free trade. For example, when Panama went through the process of joining the WTO, it had to cut its tariff base by more than 40%. So this is, just, for example, just one requirement. The main proposition that researchers has proposed, and that's the study we're going to talk about in the couple of minutes that we still have for today, is that the more rigorous the process of accession is, it requires greater change in the policy. Therefore, it offers more potential benefits from a trade standpoint. States that face greater scrutiny in this case, so when the process is even more rigorous, they have to engage in greater trade liberalization as part of this accession process. So they should experience greater benefits in terms of trade from joining the international organizations compared to those that face less scrutiny. So they are required to engage also in less trade liberalization. I talked about WTO. This is the breakdown of the countries that are members of this organization. This is per 2017. Status of the US at the moment, I'm actually not 100% sure what's the status of the US in this case, but you can see that most of the countries in the world are members of the World Trade Organizations. And we're talking about the study from by Ali and Scalera, which you had on your reader links for today. And as I said, they're focusing on the accession process. Countries that want to join and become members of the WTO, they're looking at the different requirements that they have to comply with, as well as the duration of the accession process itself. And what do they find? Let's see what they find. First of all, they show that those countries that go through an automatic process see almost no trade benefits. So automatic process means that there's not a lot of demands in terms of how much do you have to liberalize your economy or your economic policies. So there's almost no trade benefits. And that's part of the basic arguments. The second finding even more supports that, provides more support for this argument, because those that faced a tough accession process had to engage in substantial liberalization, face greater trade benefits. Even within this group of countries that face this tough accession process, those that were willing to engage in an even more substantial liberalization of their economy saw even more benefits in trade. However, their third findings actually completes the picture in this case, suggesting that the vast majority of those benefits from joining the WTO were in the immediate future, in the short term. And over the long run, the benefits were not as high. So that's part of the findings. Why are those findings important? So there's a direct question. So there's a direct implication in this case. And this is many of those countries that want to join the World Trade Organizations. In many cases, those are developing countries that have already in place before beginning the joining process. They have a substantial amount of protectionist policies. So by having positive trade effects, especially in the short term in this case, by having positive trade effects on the economy from joining the organizations, the political leaders that have to engage in those changes of various protective policies, they have kind of a political cover, because they're saying to their supporters and to members of their government and to members who support them, they tell them, yes, we have to no longer have these high tariffs that were intended to secure our producers, but we will have benefits from trade. And there is research to support that. They don't really say that, but that's the idea behind that. From a more general perspective, the findings of this research provides more evidence that the World Trade Organization as an international organization focusing mostly on economic outcomes and economic policies has a positive effect. It is an effective organization in endorsing and leading to more increase in the overall trade flows around the globe. So that's the findings we have from here. That's it. That's what I have today for international treaties, organization, institutions, and especially in the context of national security and economics. You have more research here if you want to read. I also added here, you have a link here if you're interested to not that long ago, recent Monkey Cage blog, a pretty short blog talking about the decision by the current, by President Trump regarding the World Trade Organization's any-time policy. So if you're interested, you can just press the link and go read that. Although it may be behind the paywall of the Washington Post. If you're really interested in that and you want to get access, you can also email to me and tell me that you want to read that. I'll find a way to that you will have access to that. That's it. With this, I am going to finish today. Just a quick note, I will send you later today a link to your third survey task. You will get a separate link to that, separate email for that. So, and with reminding you also the date that you have to submit that. So that's just one last thing. That's it. With that, I'm done for today, and I want to wish you hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you next week.